She could fold a parachute with enough precision to save a man falling from 4,000 feet, and the same regulations that trusted her hands with that responsibility explicitly forbade her from ever wearing one herself in the air. Across American air bases during the Second World War, thousands of women worked as parachute riggers, packing and inspecting the single piece of equipment standing between a pilot or paratrooper and certain death, and doing it under a rule that made their exclusion from actual flight almost a mathematical certainty. A parachute rigger, by regulation and by the unwritten logic of the trade, was never permitted to jump with a parachute she herself had packed. The precision that made her indispensable also guaranteed she would never personally test it in free fall. This is the story of the women who mastered one of the most exacting technical disciplines in the entire war effort, a craft where a single degree of misalignment in a fold could mean the difference between a controlled descent and a silk canopy that failed to open at all, and who carried that responsibility for thousands of jumps they were never permitted to make themselves. Parachute rigging was not treated as unskilled labor, even though it was frequently staffed with the assumption that women's supposed patience and attention to detail made them naturally suited to repetitive, careful work. The reality of the job demanded technical mastery closer to precision engineering than to any task requiring mere patience. A single parachute contained dozens of yards of silk or nylon canopy material, intricate suspension line systems, and a packing sequence that had to be followed with exact repeatability every single time because the parachute's opening sequence depended entirely on the canopy deploying in a specific order. Fold the canopy incorrectly, and lines could tangle during deployment. Pack the suspension lines in the wrong sequence, and the canopy might open only partially, producing a descent rate that offered no meaningful protection at all. The margin for error in this work was not measured in inches. It was measured in fractions of an inch, in the precise tension of a single fold, in whether a rigger's hands repeated an identical motion the same way every time across hundreds of parachutes packed in a single week. Riggers trained for months before being certified to pack a combat parachute independently, learning not just the folding sequence itself, but the underlying engineering logic behind why each fold existed in the first place. They studied how air resistance interacted with canopy shape during deployment, how suspension line length affected the timing of the opening sequence, and how humidity and temperature could subtly change the behavior of silk material in ways that required adjusting packing technique on days when weather conditions shifted. This was not intuitive craft work passed down through simple repetition. It required riggers to understand aerodynamic principles well enough to make real-time judgment calls about packing technique based on conditions that changed from one day to the next, all while working toward a standard of consistency that left effectively zero room for variation. The regulation prohibiting riggers from jumping with parachutes they had personally packed existed for a reason rooted in psychology as much as safety engineering. Military planners understood that a rigger who packed her own parachute and then used it herself created a dangerous incentive structure, an unconscious temptation to trust her own memory of the packing process rather than following the exact certified sequence every single time without deviation. The rule forced an institutional separation between the person who packed a parachute and the person who would eventually depend on it, ensuring that every jump relied on procedure rather than personal faith, and that riggers packed with the same uncompromising precision for every single parachute regardless of who would eventually wear it. The unintended consequence of that separation was that the women whose technical skill made every jump possible were structurally guaranteed to never personally verify their own work in the one way that mattered most, by falling through open air and trusting a canopy to open above them. This created a peculiar psychological weight that riggers carried through every single workday. Each parachute a rigger packed represented a complete transfer of trust, an act of technical faith extended toward a paratrooper or pilot she would likely never meet, whose survival depended entirely on whether she had executed a sequence of folds with total consistency hours or days earlier. Riggers kept meticulous records identifying exactly who packed each individual parachute, a practice that existed partly for quality control and partly because accountability mattered enormously in a discipline where a mistake could not be corrected once a jump had already begun. If a parachute failed during deployment, investigators traced the failure back to a specific rigger's packing log, an accountability structure that placed enormous pressure on every single fold a woman made, knowing her name was permanently attached to the outcome of a jump she would never personally witness and could never take back. The physical working conditions compounded the technical demands. Rigging lofts were frequently housed in unheated hangars or converted warehouse spaces where riggers worked for hours at a time, laying out canopies across long tables, checking suspension lines for any fraying or weakness, and repeating the exact folding sequence with hands that grew fatigued from the sheer physical repetition of the work. Riggers inspected material for microscopic tears or weak points invisible to a casual glance, running silk and nylon fabric through their fingers, inch by inch, trained to detect structural weaknesses that could compromise an entire canopy under the sudden violent stress of deployment. This was tactile, exacting labor performed for hours without meaningful mechanical assistance, relying entirely on trained human judgment to catch flaws that machinery of the era could not reliably detect. Beyond routine combat parachute packing, some riggers were assigned the additional responsibility of testing experimental parachute designs and emergency deployment systems, work that placed them directly at the center of aviation safety innovation without placing them anywhere near the actual risk their testing was meant to reduce. Riggers packed test parachutes that would be dropped using dummies or mechanical test rigs rather than human jumpers, analyzing deployment footage frame by frame to identify where a canopy's opening sequence deviated from expected behavior, then adjusting packing technique based on those observations to correct design flaws before a design was certified for use by actual combat personnel. This work required riggers to function simultaneously as technicians, quality inspectors, and informal aerodynamics analysts, developing an intuitive understanding of parachute deployment physics that in many cases exceeded the formal engineering training of the officers who oversaw their work. The women who staffed rigging lofts across American training bases and combat theaters packed parachutes that were used in every major airborne operation of the war, from training jumps at bases across the United States to combat jumps during the invasions of Sicily, Normandy, and the airborne operations that followed across the European theater. Every paratrooper who descended into those operations depended on a parachute packed by a rigger who would never know whether her specific work had succeeded, whose only feedback on the quality of her craft came in the form of after-action reports documenting parachute failures, reports she read with the understanding that her name might be the one attached to a specific failure identified in a specific log. Despite the extraordinary technical skill the job demanded, rigging work was frequently categorized and compensated as though it required minimal specialized training, consistent with broader wartime patterns that undervalued technical labor performed by women regardless of its actual complexity. Riggers received far less public recognition than pilots or combat personnel, despite the fact that every successful jump made throughout the war depended entirely on their precision, and despite the reality that a rigger's error carried consequences just as severe and just as final as any mistake made by a pilot in the cockpit. The asymmetry between the technical demands of the job and the institutional respect it received was not incidental. It reflected the same broader assumption that shaped how women's wartime technical labor was categorized across nearly every industry, treating extraordinary precision as an extension of feminine patience rather than as the specialized engineering skill it actually was. What makes the story of the parachute riggers resist easy sentimentality is the specific, deliberate nature of the exclusion they operated under. This was not a case of women being kept from combat roles due to general policy against female participation in direct military action. It was a much narrower and more particular exclusion, a rule that specifically prevented these women from ever personally validating the one outcome their entire profession existed to guarantee. They spent the war becoming among the most technically precise workers in the entire military supply chain, developing judgment and craft that directly determined whether other people lived or died in the air, while operating under a regulation that made it structurally impossible for them to ever test that judgment themselves in the one way that would have mattered most. The riggers who packed parachutes throughout the war left behind a legacy measured not in medals or public recognition, but in an almost invisible statistic: the difference between the rate of successful deployments and catastrophic failures across millions of individual folds made by hand under exacting technical standards. Their work demanded a level of precision most modern manufacturing processes now delegate entirely to automated machinery, performed instead by women working with silk, thread, and their own trained hands, packing trust into canopies they folded for strangers they would never meet and outcomes they would never personally witness. Every dusty page still hides a name history forgot to remember. Follow Iron Women Archives, and let's keep prying those pages open, one forgotten woman at a time.